The rain hadn't stopped for 11 days, and somewhere in that deluge, a young captain named Morris realized the Japanese couldn't see them anymore. Not through the clouds, not through the curtains of water turning every jungle track into a brown river, not from the cockpits of the Zeros that sat useless and waterlogged on distant airstrips while Australian infantry moved like shadows through terrain that should have been their graveyard. Subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. The headquarters sat 3 miles behind what optimistic maps called the front line, a generous term for the ragged perimeter where patrols vanished into green walls and sometimes didn't return. It wasn't a proper building, just a cluster of tents reinforced with salvaged timber and roofed with corrugated iron that amplified every raindrop into a percussive assault on sanity. Inside, the air hung thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of mildew eating through everything that couldn't be kept moving. Maps curled at their edges despite the weights holding them down. Someone had tried to waterproof them with a waxy substance that made the terrain features blur when touched. Morris stood at the table's edge, water still dripping from his slouch hat onto papers that documented 3 weeks of stalemate. His uniform had passed beyond wet into a state of permanent saturation that chafed in places he'd stopped thinking about. Around him, 5 other officers maintained the practiced stillness of men conserving energy in a climate that leached it away with every breath. Major Hendricks occupied the table's head, his face carved into lines that suggested he'd been 50 years old since birth. He wasn't looking at the maps. He was looking at a single sheet of paper covered in columns of numbers and meteorological symbols. The intelligence report had come up from Port Moresby that morning, carried by a runner who'd taken 4 hours to cover ground that should have taken 90 minutes. The kid had arrived looking like he'd swum the distance, which in a sense he had. But he'd protected the dispatch case like it contained the crown jewels. And maybe, in its own way, it did. The report confirmed what everyone suspected, but nobody had quite articulated. Japanese air operations out of Wewak had effectively ceased for the past week. Not reduced, ceased. Reconnaissance flights reported dozens of aircraft visible on the airstrips, clustered under whatever cover could be improvised, going nowhere. Hendricks set the paper down with the deliberate care of a man handling something that might explode. "Quote 0, he said, and his voice carried none of the satisfaction the words should have held. He sounded like someone working through a mathematical proof that kept producing an answer he didn't trust. Lieutenant Graves, who'd transferred in from the desert campaign and still moved like a man expecting firm ground under his boots, leaned forward to study the meteorological data. "Quote 1, he asked. Nobody answered immediately because nobody knew with certainty. Weather in New Guinea didn't follow rules so much as suggestions, and those changed hourly. But Sergeant Downing, who'd been running communications since the battalion landed, and possessed the institutional memory of a man who actually paid attention, cleared his throat. "Quote 2, he offered. Quote 3. This was the kind of intelligence that didn't appear in official reports. Knowledge gleaned from coastal villagers and inland guides who'd been reading these skies since childhood. The army had learned, slowly and with considerable loss, that dismissing local expertise was a luxury that cost lives. Morris watched Hendricks process this, saw the moment when possibility crystallized into something more dangerous: intent. The Major's finger traced a line on the map from their current position toward a ridge complex that intelligence had designated Hill 379. It wasn't much of a hill by any reasonable standard, but in this country, elevation meant everything. Whoever held that ridge controlled the approaches to the Ramu Valley, and whoever controlled the valley controlled the supply routes that kept the Japanese positions functioning. They'd tried twice to take it. Both times, daylight had brought the Zeros screaming down, and both times Australian infantry had been caught in the open, turned into targets on terrain that offered no cover from above. The memory sat heavy in the tent. 18 men hadn't come back from the first attempt, 23 from the second. Their names were recorded in the log Hendricks kept in his breast pocket, written in pencil because ink ran in the humidity. Morris had seen him update it by lamplight, printing each name with the careful attention of a man who knew he'd eventually answer for them. Now Hendricks was staring at that ridge again, and Morris felt something shift in the tense atmosphere. Not quite hope, because hope was too clean a word for what was taking shape. This was calculation of a grimmer sort. Hendricks said slowly, testing each word. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Every man in the tent understood what he was proposing. Using the rain not as an obstacle to overcome, but as cover to exploit. Timing an offensive not around when conditions were favorable, but when they were so unfavorable that the enemy's primary advantage became irrelevant. It violated every principle Morris had learned about coordination and combined arms, about waiting for clear weather and proper support. It suggested moving when conventional wisdom said to dig in and wait. But conventional wisdom had written those 41 names in Hendricks's notebook. Conventional wisdom said you didn't attack in monsoon conditions. And conventional wisdom hadn't accounted for an enemy whose doctrine depended so completely on air superiority that grounding their planes was equivalent to amputating their right arm. Morris looked at the rain hammering the tent roof, at the maps showing Hill 379, at the faces of men who'd buried friends under muddy crosses and were being asked to consider whether misery might be weaponized. Outside, the deluge continued its mindless percussion. Somewhere beyond it, Japanese positions sat under the same sky, but they were watching it with different eyes. They were waiting for it to clear. That was their mistake. The meteorologists arrived 2 days later, looking more like drowned academics than military personnel. 3 of them, led by a civilian consultant named Weymouth, who'd spent the previous decade forecasting for Queensland cattle stations and apparently decided that predicting death was a lateral career move. He wore spectacles held together with wire and carried his instruments in a battered leather case that suggested he'd been using the same equipment since before the war made such things impossible to replace. His assistants were younger, both commissioned lieutenants who'd been teaching mathematics before someone decided their understanding of atmospheric pressure might prove more valuable than their ability to explain calculus to disinterested teenagers. They set up shop in a corner of the headquarters tent that immediately became both the most important and least understood section of the entire operation. Weymouth unpacked a barometer, 2 thermometers, a hygrometer for measuring humidity, and what appeared to be a homemade anemometer constructed from bicycle parts and a compass. He arranged these with the fastidious care of a priest preparing an altar, then spent an hour transcribing numbers into a ledger while everyone else tried to pretend they weren't watching. Morris noticed that Weymouth's hands shook slightly, though whether from age or the constant damp or something else entirely remained unclear. Quote 6. Weymouth announced, finally, without preamble or concession to military protocol. He spoke directly to the maps rather than to Hendricks, which would have been insubordination if anyone had been inclined to care about such niceties. Quote 7. He paused, pushing his spectacles up his nose with one finger. Quote 8. Lieutenant Graves, who'd been maintaining a studied skepticism about the entire enterprise, spoke up. How long? The question everyone kept asking, as if repetition might produce a different answer. Weymouth consulted his ledger, running one finger down columns of figures that might as well have been hieroglyphics for all Morris could interpret them. 72 hours minimum, Weymouth said. Likely longer. The system feeding this has extraordinary moisture content, and the upper-level winds aren't showing any inclination to shift. 5 days would be my conservative estimate. Possibly 7. The tent fell silent except for the rain's percussion. 5 days. 7 days. An eternity in military terms, long enough to move battalions, take positions, consolidate gains. Or long enough to get stranded in terrain that would become impassable once creeks turned into torrents and slopes into mudslides. Morris watched Hendricks calculate the odds with the kind of mental arithmetic that separated competent officers from the ones who got men killed through optimism. The major's jaw worked slightly, a tell Morris had learned to recognize as meaning an order was forming. But before Hendricks could speak, Sergeant Downing produced another report, this one fresh from the wireless operators who maintained the tenuous connection to other units scattered across the theater. Sir, signal from the 15th Brigade. They attempted a reconnaissance in force near Dumpu yesterday. Japanese positions responded with small arms only. No air support observed despite clear fields of fire that would normally draw immediate response. He paused. They're noting the same pattern we are. The sky is empty. This changed things. If the phenomenon was widespread, If Japanese air assets across the entire sector were grounded simultaneously, then the opportunity wasn't limited to Hill 379. It was systemic. Morris felt the scope of what they were contemplating expand suddenly, dangerously. This wasn't about seizing one ridge. This was about exploiting a vulnerability that might not come again. About moving while the enemy's eyes were blinded and their reach shortened to whatever their infantry could hold without support from above. Weymouth was already talking again, oblivious to or unconcerned with the strategic implications of his data. Quote 14, he said. Quote 15, which meant a window. Not a large one, not guaranteed, but a window nonetheless. Morris found himself thinking about the mechanics of movement in these conditions, about what it would require to get infantry up slopes that were essentially waterfalls, through jungle where visibility drops to arm's length, across ground that turned boots into 15-pound anchors of accumulated mud. They'd trained for it, after a fashion. Everyone who'd spent time in New Guinea had learned to move through rain that turned day into twilight and made every step a negotiation with gravity and friction. But training in rain was different from fighting in it. Different from carrying ammunition that had to be kept dry, from coordinating attacks when shouted orders couldn't be heard 10 yards away, from treating casualties when every bandage soaked through immediately and stretchers became sleds. The logistics alone suggested madness. Yet the alternative was waiting for clear weather, which meant waiting for the Zeros to return, which meant going back to the careful, bloody mathematics of trading lives for yards of muddy hillside. Hendricks made his decision with characteristic lack of ceremony. Quote 16, he said to Downing. Quote 17. The phrasing was careful, bureaucratic, the kind of language that looked reasonable on paper while proposing something that would have been rejected out of hand a month earlier. But circumstances changed calculations, and 41 names in a notebook changed them further. The response came back within 2 hours, which suggested someone higher up had been thinking along similar lines. Permission granted. Execute at discretion. Additional resources unavailable due to weather constraints. In other words, go ahead, but you're on your own, and if it goes wrong, don't expect rescue or reinforcement until the sky is clear. Morris read the decoded message over Hendricks's shoulder and recognized it for what it was. Authorization hedged with deniability. The kind of order that let commanders claim credit for success or distance from failure depending on outcomes. Preparation began immediately, conducted with the muffled urgency of men who knew they were about to attempt something either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. Platoon leaders gathered their sergeants. Sergeants gathered their squads. The word spread through the camp in that peculiar way information moved through military units, half official briefing and half rumor, until everyone knew they were moving out, and nobody was quite sure they understood why. Some of the men looked relieved. Waiting in the rain was its own kind of torture, and action at least provided purpose. Others looked at the weather with expressions that suggested they questioned the sanity of anyone proposing to fight in it. Morris spent that evening checking equipment with the kind of obsessive attention that substituted for useful activity. His rifle was clean, or as clean as anything stayed in this humidity. His ammunition was distributed across multiple pouches to spread the weight and reduce the catastrophe if any one pouch got soaked through. His medical kit contained morphine syrettes that he prayed would still work if needed, despite the moisture that infiltrated everything. Around him, hundreds of men conducted similar rituals, each preparing for a battle that wouldn't begin with artillery barrage or aerial bombardment, but with the simple act of walking uphill through water that fell from above and flowed from below until the distinction between earth and sky became mostly theoretical. Weymouth appeared one final time before dark, looking even more disheveled than usual, he reported, though nobody had asked. He said this as if delivering good news, which in a sense it was. Worse weather meant lower ceilings, meant more certainty that Japanese aircraft would remain grounded. Morris thanked him, though for what exactly remained unclear. For predicting their misery? For quantifying their advantage? For reducing war to barometric measurements and wind vectors? That night, Morris lay in his tent, listening to rain that had become the soundtrack to existence, wondering if anyone had ever tried to weaponize weather before, or if they were inventing doctrine that wouldn't appear in any manual for years. The Japanese certainly hadn't anticipated it. Their entire Pacific strategy relied on air superiority, on being able to deliver bombs and bullets from above faster than enemies could organize below. Take that away, and what remained? Infantry positions that could be flanked, supply lines that could be cut, strong points that could be isolated. It was almost elegant in its simplicity, which made Morris suspicious. Elegant plans had a way of disintegrating upon contact with reality, especially reality that involved slopes measured in vertical feet and measured your progress in hours per mile rather than miles per hour. They moved out at 0400, which meant darkness so complete that the rain became purely auditory, a presence felt rather than seen. Morris led his platoon in single file along what had been a track 4 days earlier, but now resembled a creek bed. Each man's hand on the shoulder of the man ahead, because otherwise the column would fragment into isolated individuals wandering blind through hostile jungle. The rain had indeed intensified as Weymouth promised, coming down in sheets that made breathing a conscious effort, and turned the simple act of looking upward into a form of waterboarding. Within the first hour, 2 men went down with twisted ankles on ground invisible beneath their boots. The medics splinted them as best they could in the dark, then sent them hobbling back toward base with a guide who probably had even odds of finding the way. Morris felt the platoon's strength bleeding away before they'd even made contact, casualties to terrain rather than enemy action. He'd factored this into his planning, everyone had, but accounting for attrition on paper differed from watching men disappear into the darkness behind you, their curses swallowed by the rain's white noise. The Ramu Valley approach materialized gradually, more concept than location at first. The ground began sloping upward at an angle that turned walking into climbing, each step requiring deliberate placement and often a hand grabbing vegetation for purchase. Morris's map, sealed in a supposedly waterproof case, had become a soggy approximation of terrain features that bore increasingly little resemblance to what his boots encountered. Navigation became an exercise in dead reckoning and faith, trusting that the compass heading would eventually intersect with Hill 379, despite all evidence that they were simply ascending into an infinite wet darkness. Dawn, when it finally arrived, brought no improvement in visibility. The rain continued without pause, and the cloud ceiling sat so low that Morris could have thrown a rock into it if he'd had the energy for such gestures. But dawn did bring enough gray light to see perhaps 20 yards ahead, which felt like luxury after the blind stumbling of the previous hours. It also brought the first sign they weren't alone in this misery. A Japanese supply dump, abandoned but recent, boxes of ammunition stacked under a canvas tarp that had torn loose and now flapped uselessly in the wind. Corporal Deacon, who had a talent for reading abandoned positions, examined the site with the focused attention of an archaeologist studying artifacts. "Quote 20, he muttered, pulling back the tarp to reveal ration boxes with Japanese characters stenciled on the sides. Quote 21. Morris understood the implication immediately. Japanese forces were consolidating, pulling back from forward positions they couldn't maintain without aerial resupply. The weather wasn't just grounding aircraft, it was strangling the entire logistical network that kept scattered positions viable. The discovery changed everyone's alertness level. If Japanese troops had withdrawn recently, they were somewhere ahead, probably dug in at the ridge complex itself. Morris passed word down the column to increase spacing and keep weapons ready, though what state those weapons were in after 6 hours of submersion remained a question nobody wanted answered until necessary. His own rifle felt heavier with water, the action stiff despite his best efforts to keep it protected. Around him, men checked magazines and cleared chambers with movements that had become ritual, preparing for contact that could come from any direction in visibility that barely qualified as such. The approach to Hill 379 took another 3 hours, time dilated by exhaustion, and the surreal quality of moving through a world reduced to mud and rain, and the occasional tree looming from the grayness. Twice they passed more abandoned positions, each showing signs of hasty evacuation. Once they found a Japanese soldier dead in a foxhole, his body already bloating in the heat despite the rain. Nobody stopped to investigate cause of death. In this country, death had numerous causes, and most of them were mundane: disease, exposure, infected wounds, or simply giving up in conditions that made survival feel like an active choice requiring daily renewal. The ridge itself appeared as a darker mass in the grayness, a hulking presence more felt than seen. Morris halted the column with a raised fist and sent scouts forward, watching them vanish into the rain within seconds. The waiting stretched, every sense straining for sounds that the downpour erased. Gunfire, shouts, the distinctive crack of grenades. Nothing. Just rain and the occasional drip from overhead vegetation, and the sound of his own breathing loud in his ears. The scouts returned after 20 minutes that felt like hours, reporting minimal activity observed. Japanese positions were there, visible as darker patches in the hillside, but no movement detected, no sentries visible. Either the Japanese had abandoned the ridge entirely, which seemed unlikely given its tactical importance, or they were so focused on simply surviving the weather that they'd ceased effective observation of approaches. Morris chose to believe the latter, because believing the former meant walking into a position that might be heavily defended despite appearances. He signaled the advance, and the platoon began moving upslope, each man crouched despite the lack of enemy fire, instinct warring with the practical knowledge that staying low just made the climb harder. They were within 50 yards of the first Japanese bunker when everything changed. Not through gunfire or grenades, but through the simple acoustic event of silence. The rain stopped. Not gradually, not tapering off, but stopping as if someone had closed a valve. One moment the downpour continued its relentless percussion, the next moment nothing but dripping aftermath. Morris froze mid-step, looking up at clouds that still hung oppressively low, but had somehow ceased dumping their contents. Around him the entire platoon had stopped, every man looking skyward, with expressions mixing relief and something approaching horror. Because if the rain had stopped here, it had stopped everywhere. Which meant Japanese pilots at Wewak would be doing exactly what Morris would do in their position: running for their aircraft, firing up engines, getting airborne while the window lasted. The weather advantage that had protected the advance for the past 6 hours might have just evaporated with the clouds. Morris checked his watch. 09:30. They'd been moving for 5.5 hours and were exposed on a hillside with no overhead cover, exactly the scenario that had cost 41 lives in previous attempts. Hendricks came up on the radio, his voice tight with controlled urgency. All units, weather break observed. Accelerate to objectives immediately. Window is unknown duration. Unknown duration. Military speak for, we have no idea if we've got 5 minutes or 5 hours. Morris translated this for his platoon with hand signals. Move faster, damn the noise, get to those bunkers before the sky fills with zeros. The men responded with the desperate energy of soldiers who understood their survival now depended on speed rather than stealth. The first bunker was unoccupied, its firing slit facing downslope toward approaches that any sane attacker would use during clear weather. The second bunker held 3 Japanese soldiers who appeared as surprised as Morris felt, their weapons stacked against the wall while they'd been doing something that left their hands full of rice. The subsequent engagement was brief and ugly, the kind of close-quarters violence that happened too fast for fear and left everyone shaking afterward. Morris's platoon secured the position, while his ears strained for the sound they all dreaded: aircraft engines. The sky remained silent. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of held breath, of clouds that might part at any moment to reveal the aluminum bellies of bombers or the predatory silhouettes of fighters. Morris positioned his men in the captured bunkers and looked back down the slope they'd just climbed. Other platoons were visible now in the improved visibility, dark lines of men moving upward with the urgency of ants fleeing a flood. Behind them, the jungle stretched away toward base camp, every unit caught in the same desperate race against weather they couldn't control and an enemy that might already be lifting off from distant airfields. The rain started again 11 minutes later, resuming with the same abruptness with which it had ceased. Morris felt his shoulders drop with relief he hadn't known he was holding. Around him, men exchanged looks that acknowledged how close they'd come to disaster, how the entire offensive had balanced on 11 minutes of uncertain sky. But they'd made it to the ridge. They held positions that would have been impossible to take under clear weather. the gamble had paid off, at least for the moment. Whether it would continue paying off depended on factors utterly beyond their control. Barometric pressure, wind patterns, the mysterious mechanics of tropical weather systems that Weymouth claimed to understand, but which seemed to Morris more like organized chaos than predictable science. Somewhere below, Japanese forces were regrouping, probably trying to understand how Australian infantry had appeared on positions that should have been secure. Somewhere above, aircraft sat grounded or struggled to take off in conditions that shifted minute by minute. And somewhere in headquarters, Weymouth was probably checking his instruments, updating his predictions, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. Morris settled into the bunker that had belonged to someone else an hour earlier, and waited for whatever came next, knowing only that the rain was both his enemy and his ally, and that distinguishing between the two was becoming increasingly difficult. The Japanese counterattack came at 1400 hours, not with the coordinated precision their doctrine demanded, but with the desperate improvisation of forces cut off from command and aerial reconnaissance. Morris heard them before he saw them, voices shouting coordination through the rain, the metallic clatter of equipment, the distinctive sound of Type 99 rifles being charged. He had perhaps 30 seconds to position his men before the first wave emerged from the tree line below, climbing toward the bunkers with the grim determination of soldiers who understood their position had become untenable without recapturing the high ground. The engagement devolved into the kind of fighting that training manuals couldn't adequately describe. Chaotic, brutal, compressed into distances where grenades were more useful than rifles, and visibility changed every few seconds as rain intensity fluctuated. Morris fired at shapes that materialized from grayness, never certain if his shots connected until bodies fell or kept advancing. The bunker's firing slit, designed to provide protection and clear lanes of fire, became a liability when Japanese infantry got close enough to throw explosives through it. One grenade landed inside, spinning on the wet floor for an eternal second before Corporal Deacon kicked it back through the aperture, where it detonated with a concussion that left everyone's ears ringing. The attack broke after 20 minutes, Japanese forces withdrawing into the jungle having failed to dislodge the Australians, but having demonstrated they weren't simply abandoning the position. Morris counted his casualties. 3 wounded, none fatally so far, and ammunition expenditure that would become a serious problem if resupply couldn't make it up the slope. He radioed the situation to Hendricks, who responded with information both encouraging and troubling. Other positions along the ridge had been secured with similar resistance, but 2 supply columns attempting to bring ammunition and medical supplies forward had become mired in terrain that was deteriorating by the hour. This was the calculation nobody had adequately factored. Taking the position during the weather was one thing, but holding it required supplies that couldn't move in the same conditions that had enabled the attack. Morris looked at his remaining ammunition, perhaps 200 rounds distributed across 8 men still combat effective, and tried to estimate how long they could hold against determined counterattacks. The math wasn't encouraging. Neither was the view downslope, where the track they'd climbed that morning had transformed into a waterfall, impassable to anyone carrying significant loads. Private Henderson, who'd worked as a surveyor before the war and retained an unfortunate tendency to calculate slopes and water flow rates during inappropriate moments, pointed out that the ridge they occupied was becoming an island. Quote, 23, he said, studying the valley with professional interest. Quote, 24. Morris told him to shut up, because confirming everyone's private fears served no useful purpose. But Henderson had a point. They'd gambled on the weather enabling the attack without fully considering that the same weather would prevent consolidation. The afternoon brought a development that changed the tactical picture entirely. A Japanese supply column, attempting to reach their own forces higher up the ridge, stumbled into Australian positions in the reduced visibility. The engagement was brief. The Japanese escort surrendered after token resistance, clearly having concluded that dying for a supply run made little sense when their primary positions had already fallen. But the captured supplies themselves proved more valuable than ammunition. Radio equipment, maps showing Japanese dispositions across the entire sector, and a dispatch case containing orders that Hendricks would later describe as intelligence gold. The documents, translated by a Nisei linguist attached to brigade headquarters, revealed something the Australians had suspected but couldn't confirm. Japanese High Command had ordered general withdrawal from forward positions throughout the valley, consolidating forces closer to Madang, where supply lines were shorter and air cover more reliable once weather permitted. The orders specified that Hill 379 was to be held only if tenable, abandoned if not, with priority given to preserving forces rather than terrain. In other words, the counterattack Morris had just repelled might have been the last serious attempt to retake the position. But the same documents revealed a more troubling reality. Japanese commanders were acutely aware of their air superiority problem and were implementing countermeasures. Engineers at Wewak and Madang airfields were working around the clock to improve drainage, lay perforated steel planking, and create all-weather surfaces that would allow operations during monsoon conditions. The timeline suggested these improvements might be operational within 2 to 3 weeks. The window of opportunity the Australians were exploiting wasn't infinite. It was closing on a schedule determined by engineering capacity and available materials. Hendricks convened a radio conference that evening, all unit commanders reporting in from positions strung along the ridge like beads on a string. The situation across the sector was remarkably consistent. Positions taken with lighter casualties than anticipated, ammunition and supplies running low, resupply problematic due to terrain, Japanese forces probing but not mounting major counterattacks. The weather had enabled a tactical success, but that same weather was now preventing the consolidation necessary to make the success strategic rather than temporary. They needed supplies, reinforcements, and evacuation capability for wounded, all of which required either the rain to stop or engineering miracles nobody had equipment to perform. Then Lieutenant Patterson, commanding a platoon on the northern section of the ridge, reported something that changed the conversation. His scouts had discovered a Japanese-built track leading down the reverse slope, engineered with drainage culverts and log corduroying that made it passable even in current conditions. The Japanese had clearly invested significant effort in creating a supply route that could function during the monsoon, probably spending weeks on construction that Australian forces now stood to inherit. Patterson's men had followed it for half a mile before encountering a Japanese rearguard that withdrew after brief contact. The track appeared to lead all the way to the valley floor, and potentially beyond. This was the break that transformed isolation into opportunity. If the track could handle Japanese supply wagons, it could handle Australian ones. Hendricks immediately ordered engineers forward to assess the route and determine what would be needed to make it functional for their purposes. The engineers arrived after dark, moving with the careful steps of men who knew one misstep in darkness on a mountain slope meant a fall that might not end until hitting something solid several hundred feet below. They disappeared down the track with measuring tapes and notebooks, leaving Morris and his platoon to wonder if they'd just discovered the solution to their supply problem, or simply inherited a different set of difficulties. The night brought developments that made supply concerns temporarily secondary. Japanese forces, apparently concluding that conventional counterattacks were too costly, began employing tactics that Morris associated more with harassment than serious assault. Small groups infiltrated close to Australian positions, close enough to throw grenades or fire bursts before withdrawing into darkness. They seemed less interested in retaking positions than in preventing the Australians from getting any rest, a war of attrition waged through exhaustion rather than casualties. By midnight, Morris's platoon had been on continuous alert for 20 hours, every man operating on reserves that were running dangerously low. The rain fluctuated throughout the night, sometimes stopping entirely for periods of 15 or 20 minutes, each cessation bringing the same spike of anxiety about aircraft that might exploit the break. But the clouds remained low, the ceiling never rising above what Morris estimated as 200 feet, and no engine sounds disturbed the night beyond the distant rumble of something that might have been thunder or might have been artillery too far away to matter. The Japanese were grounded still, their most potent weapon neutralized by atmospheric conditions that cared nothing for doctrine or strategy. At 0300, the engineers returned with news both good and problematic. The track was usable, but would require significant work, clearing recent landslides, reinforcing sections where erosion had undermined the corduroying, establishing checkpoints to prevent Japanese infiltration along a route that now represented their primary vulnerability. The lead engineer, a captain named Byrne, who spoke with the flat certainty of someone who'd spent his civilian life building roads through difficult country, estimated they could have a supply column through by the following afternoon if they started work immediately and if, always the conditional, the rain didn't intensify beyond current levels. Hendricks authorized the work without hesitation, committing their limited engineering resources to a gamble that the track would prove worth the investment. Morris listened to this decision over the radio and understood they'd moved beyond the initial tactical opportunity into something more complex, attempting to establish a sustainable supply line through terrain that actively resisted human presence, betting that weather would remain hostile enough to keep Japanese aircraft grounded, but not so hostile that it made their own operations impossible. They were threading a needle that kept moving, and the margin for error felt vanishingly small. Dawn arrived with rain that had settled into a steady downpour, heavy enough to maintain the low ceiling, but not the torrential deluge that had characterized previous days. Weymouth's forecast, relayed through headquarters, predicted continuation of current conditions for at least 48 hours, possibly longer. The barometric pressure was holding steady in the low range. The wind patterns showed no signs of shifting, and the moisture content suggested the system feeding the monsoon remained robust. In other words, more of the same, which under current circumstances qualified as good news. Morris repeated this information to his platoon, watching exhausted men try to find relief in meteorological predictions they had no reason to trust, but every reason to hope were accurate. The first supply column reached Morris's position at 1600 hours the following day, led by a sergeant major named Quillen, who looked like he'd aged a decade during the climb. His face was gray with exhaustion, uniform plastered to his body with mud that had worked itself into every crease and fold. Behind him, a line of bearers struggled upslope, carrying ammunition boxes, medical supplies, and rations that represented the difference between holding the ridge and abandoning it. Quillen dropped his pack with a grunt that suggested he might never pick up anything heavy again, then reported the journey had cost them 2 men to the terrain, one broken leg when a log gave way beneath him, another swept into a ravine when the bank he'd been traversing collapsed without warning. The supplies themselves were a mixed blessing. Ammunition enough for perhaps 2 days of sustained fighting, assuming the fighting remained at current intensity levels. Medical supplies that would treat a dozen serious casualties, or twice that many minor ones. Rations that might have been edible before spending 12 hours being dragged through mud and water, but now qualified as sustenance only in the technical sense. Morris distributed the ammunition immediately, watching his men check loads with the focused attention of people who'd been rationing shots and wondering when the mathematics would run out. The arrival of fresh supplies changed the psychological calculus as much as the practical one. They weren't abandoned, the supply line functioned. Holding the position remained feasible rather than suicidal. But Quillen brought more than supplies. He brought news from the wider war, fragments of intelligence that suggested the weather-enabled offensive was having effects beyond their immediate tactical situation. Other Australian units across New Guinea were reporting similar patterns. Japanese air activity reduced to near zero, ground forces pulling back from exposed positions, supply lines collapsing under the dual pressure of monsoon conditions and disrupted aerial resupply. What had started as one unit's opportunistic exploitation of weather was becoming something larger, a theater-wide phenomenon that higher command was scrambling to coordinate and exploit before the window closed. The Americans at Finschhafen had noticed too, according to Quillen's relay of camp gossip, mixed with whatever official information had filtered down through the ranks. Their liaison officers were asking questions about Australian tactics, about how units were moving during weather that U.S. doctrine said precluded offensive operations. Some expressed skepticism. Americans tended to place enormous faith in their material superiority in air power, and the idea of deliberately attacking when air support was unavailable violated their operational principles. Others were intrigued, recognizing that conditions which grounded aircraft affected both sides, but favored whoever was willing to move despite the misery. Morris filed this information away as interesting, but ultimately irrelevant to his immediate concerns, which involved keeping his platoon combat effective while occupying positions that remained under sporadic harassment. The Japanese hadn't mounted another serious counterattack, but they hadn't conceded the ridge either. Small groups continued probing defenses, testing reaction times, mapping positions for what Morris assumed would eventually become either another assault or intelligence for artillery strikes, once weather permitted observation. Each probe cost ammunition they could barely spare, frayed nerves already worn thin by exhaustion, and created a persistent anxiety that any engagement might be the prelude to something larger. The wounded presented their own problem. Morris had 7 men now, with injuries ranging from minor shrapnel wounds to what the medic diagnosed as a potentially serious infection from a cut sustained 3 days earlier that had festered in the constant moisture. Evacuation down the track was theoretically possible, but practically hazardous. Stretcher cases would require 4 bearers each, moving slowly on terrain where one misstep meant losing not just the casualty, but potentially the entire team. The medic, a corporal named Strange who'd been a veterinarian in civilian life and approached human medicine with the same pragmatic detachment he'd presumably shown livestock, recommended holding the wounded in place and treating them as best possible with available supplies, rather than risking evacuation. This decision bothered Morris more than he'd expected. Letting men suffer in conditions that would shock most hospital administrators, while hoping their injuries didn't worsen, felt like a betrayal of the duty of care that command supposedly entailed. But Strange pointed out with veterinary bluntness that moving them risked turning treatable injuries into fatal ones, that infection rates on stretchers bouncing down muddy tracks exceeded infection rates in stationary positions with proper wound care, and that several of the wounded were ambulatory enough to provide useful defensive capability if things went badly. The logic was sound, even if it tasted like abandonment. The 3rd day on the ridge brought an unexpected visitor, Weymouth himself, having somehow made the climb despite appearing physically unsuited for anything more strenuous than reading instruments in a dry tent. He arrived looking like a drowned scarecrow, his wire-rimmed spectacles fogged useless, but carrying his barometer in a protective case held against his chest like sacred scripture. Morris watched this apparition materialize from the rain and felt the surreal disconnect of watching a weatherman make house calls to active combat positions. Weymouth seemed oblivious to the incongruity, immediately setting up his equipment on a relatively flat section of bunker and beginning his measurements. "Quote 25, Weymouth announced, wiping his spectacles on a handkerchief that was somehow less wet than the glasses themselves. Quote 26. He said this with the satisfaction of someone whose professional predictions were proving accurate, apparently unconcerned that his accuracy meant 7 to 10 more days of this misery for everyone involved. Morris thanked him with what he hoped sounded like genuine appreciation, rather than the impulse to push the weatherman off the ridge and see if he could predict his own trajectory. But Weymouth's extended forecast carried implications beyond personal discomfort. 7 to 10 more days of grounded Japanese aircraft meant 7 to 10 more days to consolidate positions, establish supply lines, and potentially push the offensive deeper into terrain that would be impossible to take under clear skies. It also meant 7 to 10 more days of living in conditions that were grinding men down through simple accumulated exhaustion, trench foot, respiratory infections, and the psychological toll of never being dry, never being warm, never being able to see more than 50 yards in any direction. The question was whether the strategic advantage gained would outweigh the physical cost extracted. And that was mathematics nobody could calculate in advance. Hendricks must have been working through similar calculations, because new orders came down that evening. Prepare for further advance towards secondary objectives along the ridge complex, with movement to commence within 48 hours, pending supply situation improvement. The orders were phrased as directives, but felt more like questions. Could they push further? Should they push further? What was the break-even point where weather advantage became outweighed by physical degradation? Morris studied his men, filthy, exhausted, several showing signs of the respiratory infections that were inevitable when you spent days soaked through, and wondered how much more they had to give. Private Henderson provided an unwelcome answer during the evening brief. He'd been tracking water levels in the creeks below and had concluded they were approaching flood stage. Quote 27. He reported with the clinical detachment of someone describing abstract hydrological phenomena rather than conditions that might drown friendly forces. Quote 28. This information spread through the position with the speed of genuinely bad news, faster than official communications could have moved it. Base camp underwater meant supply storage threatened, medical facilities compromised, and their line of withdrawal potentially cut if they needed to pull back. It also meant the gamble on weather had generated consequences nobody had fully anticipated. They'd gained tactical advantage, but might be trading it for strategic isolation. Morris tried to calculate whether they could sustain operations from the ridge indefinitely, supplied only via the captured Japanese track, and the mathematics kept producing answers he didn't like. The night brought the heaviest rain yet, a deluge so intense that visibility dropped to less than arm's length, and the sound made verbal communication impossible beyond shouting directly into someone's ear. Morris sat in the bunker listening to water pound the roof with force that suggested the sky was physically falling, wondering if this was Weymouth's predicted intensification, or if the weather was exceeding even the meteorologist's extended forecast. Either way, it rendered them effectively blind and deaf, unable to detect Japanese movement until it was immediately upon them, dependent entirely on the assumption that the enemy was equally immobilized by conditions that had passed beyond merely hostile into actively malevolent. Somewhere in that darkness, Japanese commanders were presumably making their own calculations about what could be held, what must be abandoned, and whether their engineers at Wewak were making sufficient progress on all-weather runways to restore air superiority before ground positions became completely untenable. Somewhere further back, Australian High Command was looking at maps and casualty reports, and trying to determine whether this weather-enabled offensive represented a tactical opportunity or a strategic blunder that would reveal itself only when the skies cleared and the bills came due. And somewhere overhead, clouds pressed down like a physical weight, holding aircraft grounded and infantry isolated in a contest being mediated entirely by atmospheric pressure and precipitation rates that cared nothing for human intentions or consequences. Morris checked his watch. 2,200 hours. 72 hours since they'd taken the ridge. 4 days since the offensive began. 7 to 10 more days if Weymouth's forecast held. He tried to imagine 10 more days of this, and couldn't. Tried to imagine what the tactical situation would look like when weather finally broke, and couldn't manage that either. The future had contracted to the immediate. Next patrol, next supply run, next few hours of staying alert, despite exhaustion that made thought feel like wading through the same mud that surrounded everything else. The rain continued its percussion, and Morris settled in to wait for whatever dawn would bring, knowing only that it would involve water and uncertainty in roughly equal measure. The Japanese response came not through counterattack, but through something Morris found more unsettling: complete withdrawal from their remaining forward positions. Patrols sent out at first light on the 4th day found bunkers abandoned, equipment destroyed or removed, even the dead buried or carried away. The enemy had pulled back during the night, using the rain's acoustic cover to evacuate positions they'd held for months, leaving nothing useful behind except the absence itself. Morris stood in a Japanese command post, still bearing the debris of hasty departure. Scattered papers, a broken radio, spent cartridges swept into a corner, and tried to interpret what the withdrawal meant. Lieutenant Patterson, whose platoon had discovered the evacuation first, offered the optimistic reading. The Japanese were conceding the entire sector, recognizing they couldn't hold without air support, and choosing to consolidate closer to their main bases. But Corporal Deacon, who had a talent for pessimistic accuracy, suggested an alternative. The enemy was pulling back to prepare defensive positions that would be easier to supply and harder to assault, trading space for sustainability. They were adapting to the weather rather than being defeated by it, making tactical adjustments that would matter more once conditions normalized and their aircraft could fly again. Hendricks ordered an advance to occupy the abandoned positions, which sounded decisive in the radio transmission but felt more complicated in execution. Moving forward meant extending supply lines that were already strained, occupying positions they didn't have troops to properly garrison, and potentially walking into prepared ambushes at whatever line the Japanese had chosen to actually defend. Morris led his platoon forward through terrain that showed increasing evidence of long-term Japanese occupation. Cleared fields of fire, well-constructed bunkers with overhead cover that might have protected against artillery if artillery could have been brought to bear, supply caches that had been systematically emptied or destroyed. The advance covered 3 miles in 2 days, which would have been glacial progress under normal conditions, but represented substantial achievement given terrain that remained barely passable. They moved through abandoned villages where the rain had turned earthen floors to soup and thatch roofs sagged with water weight. They crossed streams that had been ankle-deep creeks on Morris's map, but were now waist-deep torrents requiring rope lines to traverse safely. One soldier was nearly swept away despite the rope, saved only by Corporal Deacon's grab that left both men bruised but alive. The incident slowed the advance by an hour, while everyone reevaluated their assessment of acceptable risk. The new positions they occupied sat astride what intelligence identified as a primary Japanese supply route, though calling it a route was generous given current conditions. Engineers came forward to assess whether it could be made functional for Australian use, but their verdict wasn't encouraging. The Japanese had built for their own logistics, lighter loads, different vehicles, supply doctrine that emphasized man-portable equipment over mechanized transport. Adapting the route for Australian purposes would require extensive work that might not be worth the investment if the weather broke and air superiority reverted to Japanese control. They were capturing infrastructure designed for a different kind of war. The 5th day brought an event that changed perceptions across the entire theater. Confirmation that Japanese engineers had succeeded in getting aircraft operational at Madang despite ongoing weather. The report came through signals intelligence first, radio intercepts indicating flight operations that analysts initially dismissed as deception or misinterpretation. But subsequent visual confirmation from a patrol near the coast proved it true. Japanese bombers had managed takeoff and landing on newly surfaced runway sections, conducting limited operations during brief breaks in the weather. The window of complete air superiority was closing. Hendricks convened another radio conference, his voice carrying an edge Morris hadn't heard before. The tactical situation had fundamentally changed. If Japanese aircraft could operate even intermittently, then the cover that had enabled the offensive was no longer absolute. Units would need to disperse, dig deeper, prepare for the aerial attacks that had made previous advances so costly. But dispersing meant reducing combat effectiveness, and digging deeper meant time and effort they didn't have. They were caught between 2 problems: clustering enough to hold positions, or spreading enough to survive what was coming. Weymouth, summoned again for his expertise, offered an explanation that felt more like excuse than forecast. The Japanese had evidently invested in drainage technology and runway surfacing materials that Australian intelligence hadn't known they possessed. Perforated steel planking and crushed coral bases were allowing operations in conditions that would ground conventional airfields. Weymouth said, his tone suggesting professional respect for the engineering, even as it undermined his own predictions. Quote 30, he amended. Quote 31. The first Japanese air raid came that afternoon. 3 bombers that emerged from cloud cover at 500 feet, far lower than doctrine recommended but necessary given the ceiling. They dropped their loads on positions 2 miles south of Morris's location, the explosions audible even through the rain as dull crumps that rolled across the valley. Casualties were reported as light. The bombs had mostly impacted in mud that absorbed their blast, but the psychological effect was significant. Men who'd grown accustomed to moving in daylight without fear of aerial attack now found themselves checking the sky constantly, knowing that any break in the clouds might bring death from above. Morris watched his platoon's behavior change in subtle ways. Movement became more cautious, spacing increased. Soldiers gravitated toward whatever overhead cover existed, even when it wouldn't stop bombs. They were reverting to the defensive posture that had characterized operations before the Monsoon Offensive, the psychological shift happening faster than tactical doctrine could adjust. The weather still provided substantial protection. The bombers couldn't fly often, couldn't fly with precision, couldn't coordinate with ground forces through the rain. But absolute protection had become relative protection, and relative protection felt dangerously inadequate after days of operating without fear from above. The question that nobody was asking directly, but everyone was calculating privately: had they pushed far enough to justify the inevitable cost when weather normalized? The offensive had seized significant terrain, disrupted Japanese supply lines, captured intelligence materials, and demonstrated tactical flexibility that might prove valuable in future operations. But holding what they'd taken would require defending positions that had been seized under weather conditions that were already changing. Morris looked at his map, at the extended supply lines and scattered positions, and tried to determine what victory looked like in a situation where success and overextension might be the same thing. That night brought another development that complicated the strategic picture. Australian headquarters issued preliminary orders for contingency withdrawal plans. The phrasing was careful, quote 32 and quote 33 doing heavy lifting, but the implication was clear. Higher command was preparing for the possibility that the offensive couldn't be sustained once Japanese air operations normalized. The orders specified fallback positions, supply priorities for withdrawal, and procedures for destroying equipment that couldn't be evacuated. Reading them felt like watching command lose confidence in real time, abandoning the aggressive posture that had characterized the past week in favor of defensive thinking. Hendrix's response to these orders revealed more about his own calculations than official communications ever would. He acknowledged receipt, but requested permission to conduct one more forward push, arguing they had perhaps 48 hours before Japanese air operations became sufficiently robust to make offensive movement prohibitively costly. The target he proposed was a supply depot that intelligence indicated contained fuel and ammunition stocks the Japanese were attempting to evacuate. Interdicting those supplies would hamper enemy operations even after Australian forces withdrew, making any subsequent Japanese offensive more difficult. It was a gamble, but gambling had characterized the entire operation. Permission came back within hours. Authorized. Executed discretion. Be prepared to disengage rapidly if air threat intensifies. Morris received his movement orders at 0200, with jump-off scheduled for 0500. 3 hours to prepare for what might be the final push of the offensive, moving toward an objective that represented either strategic opportunity or catastrophic overreach, depending on factors that remained beyond anyone's control. He briefed his platoon in darkness, made absolute by rain that had returned to its earlier intensity, watching exhausted faces try to process information about yet another advance, when most of them looked barely capable of walking. Private Henderson, who'd been quietly tracking both meteorological and tactical developments in his survey notebook, offered an observation that nobody wanted to hear, but everyone needed to consider. "We've been operating for 5 days on the assumption that weather favors us," he said. "But we're just as stuck in this mud as the Japanese. The difference was, we were willing to move through it, and they weren't. If they've started moving too, if they've decided to match our willingness to fight in these conditions, then the advantage reverses. They know this terrain better. They've been here longer, and we're at the end of a supply line that's one good landslide away from not existing." Morris told Henderson to shut up for the second time in a week, but the observation lingered. They'd weaponized weather by being willing to endure what their enemy wouldn't, but endurance had limits, and those limits were approaching rapidly. The supply depot raid would either vindicate the offensive's logic or expose its fundamental flaw. That tactical opportunity created by weather could evaporate as quickly as the conditions that enabled it, leaving forces overextended in terrain that had always favoured defence over attack. The rain continued, steady now rather than torrential, and Morris wondered if that moderation represented improvement or just a different kind of problem. At 0430, he gave the order to move out, leading his platoon into darkness that might contain either victory or the correction that overconfidence always eventually encountered. The approach to the supply depot required traversing a section of valley floor that reconnaissance photographs from before the monsoon showed as open ground suitable for rapid movement. Those photographs had become historical documents bearing little resemblance to current reality. What had been firm earth was now swamp. What had been drainage ditches were now canals. And what the map optimistically labeled as a, quote, 36 had become a river 50 feet wide, moving with sufficient force to carry away anything not firmly anchored. Morris stood at its edge, watching brown water churn past, carrying debris that included at least one Japanese ammunition crate, and what might have been part of a wooden bridge, and reconsidered whether the objective was worth the approach. Corporal Deacon found a crossing point quarter-mile upstream, where fallen trees created a natural dam that reduced water velocity to merely dangerous rather than suicidal. The platoon crossed in pairs, each man roped to the next, moving with the careful deliberation of people who understood that mistakes here wouldn't involve second chances. 2 men lost their footing despite precautions, saved only by the rope lines and the strength of soldiers who'd developed the kind of desperate grip that fear provides. The crossing consumed an hour, left everyone soaked beyond what had become baseline wetness, and deposited them on the far bank with the certain knowledge that retreat via the same route would be even more difficult with potentially wounded men and any captured supplies. The depot materialized from the grayness as a collection of structures that suggested Japanese forces had been preparing for extended occupation before weather forced reconsideration. Proper buildings rather than tents, constructed with lumber that must have been transported at considerable cost and effort. Corrugated metal roofing that would have provided genuine protection from the rain if it hadn't been partially torn away by wind. Storage sheds arranged in a pattern that indicated someone had thought about logistics, about efficient movement of supplies from storage to transport, about defense against ground attack, if not aerial bombardment. The Japanese had built infrastructure for a campaign they'd expected to fight, and now it sat mostly abandoned, a monument to plans that weather had rendered obsolete. Mostly abandoned, but not entirely. Morris's forward scouts reported movement in the central building, possibly a rear guard left behind to destroy supplies before complete evacuation. The ethical calculation was straightforward in theory. Neutralize the guard, secure the supplies. But implementation was complicated by visibility that remained abysmal, and the knowledge that any firefight would alert Japanese forces to their presence. Surprise was the only advantage they possessed, and surprise evaporated the moment someone fired the first shot. Morris deployed his platoon in a loose cordon around the depot and waited for an opportunity that might present itself, or might require creation. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. The rain intensified again, transitioning from steady downpour to torrential deluge in the space of minutes. Visibility dropped to the point where Morris could barely see the soldier positioned 10 feet away, which meant the Japanese guards couldn't see much further. He gave the order to move in, and the platoon converged on the central building in a rush that relied more on momentum than coordination. The subsequent engagement happened at ranges where rifles were nearly useless, devolving into the kind of close-quarters chaos that training attempted to prepare people for, but never quite managed. 3 Japanese soldiers died in the first seconds, caught completely unprepared. A 4th surrendered, hands raised in a gesture that transcended language. The 5th wasn't in the building at all, but in an outbuilding they hadn't spotted, and his warning shots brought everything to a halt as both sides reassessed. The standoff lasted perhaps 5 minutes, though time became elastic in situations where every second involved recalculating survival odds. Morris positioned his men behind whatever cover the depot provided, while the lone Japanese holdout fired sporadic shots that suggested he had ammunition, but uncertain aim. Then the rain did something Morris had never witnessed. It transitioned from torrential to what could only be described as apocalyptic. Water fell with such intensity that breathing required conscious effort, visibility dropped to arm's length, and the sound made communication impossible beyond touch. The Japanese soldier apparently reached the same conclusion Morris did, that continuing the fight in these conditions served no purpose, and simply stopped shooting. When Morris's men finally reached the outbuilding, they found it empty except for spent cartridges and a rifle that had been left propped against the wall. The Japanese soldier had used the rain as cover for withdrawal, disappearing into conditions that would hide an army, much less a single man. Morris let him go, partly because pursuit was impossible, and partly because something in the deliberate placement of the rifle suggested a soldier who'd concluded his war was over, regardless of what his commanders might think. They'd secured the depot without additional casualties, which felt like the kind of minor miracle that this campaign dealt out occasionally between extended periods of making everything difficult. The supplies themselves exceeded expectations in both quantity and condition. Drums of fuel that would keep Australian vehicles running for weeks if they could be transported back. Ammunition that wasn't compatible with Australian weapons, but could be stockpiled for future use or denial to the enemy. Medical supplies, including sulfa drugs and morphine, that were worth their weight in gold given current shortages. Rice in quantities that suggested the Japanese had been planning to feed a substantial garrison. And documents. Always documents, including what appeared to be complete logistics manifests detailing supply schedules, transport routes, and depot locations throughout the sector. But securing supplies and exploiting them were different problems, and the latter was proving substantially harder than the former. The fuel drums each weighed over 400 pounds, far beyond what infantry could carry. The ammunition crates were marginally more portable, but still represented loads that would slow movement to a crawl. Even the medical supplies and documents, relatively light by comparison, would burden soldiers who were already operating at the edge of physical capability. Morris radioed Hendricks with an inventory and a request for guidance, knowing the answer would probably involve leaving most of it behind after destroying what couldn't be carried, which felt like climbing a mountain to plant a flag and then immediately tearing it down. Hendricks's response surprised everyone. Engineers were already moving forward with equipment to establish a forward supply point at the depot location, with plans to use the captured Japanese infrastructure as a logistics hub for continued operations. The decision represented either brilliant opportunism or dangerous optimism, depending on whether the weather continued favoring Australian operations or broke in time for Japanese aircraft to target an obvious and valuable position. Morris received orders to secure the perimeter and hold until engineering elements arrived, estimated time 4 to 6 hours depending on conditions and enemy activity. 6 hours at an exposed position that was certainly known to Japanese forces and likely already targeted for counterattack or artillery strike once weather permitted. Morris positioned his platoon in defensive positions around the depot's perimeter and settled in for what he knew would be an extended period of vigilance against threats that could materialize from any direction. The rain had moderated again to merely heavy, which meant visibility improved to perhaps 30 yards. Enough to see threats approaching, but not enough to provide early warning. The tactical mathematics were uncomfortable. They held a position worth defending, but lacked the resources to defend it properly if the Japanese decided it was worth retaking. The prisoner they'd taken proved more talkative than expected once Corporal Deacon, who'd picked up passable Japanese from a Nisei girlfriend before the war, began asking questions. The soldier was young, probably no more than 20, and seemed relieved to be out of the fighting. He confirmed that Japanese forces had been withdrawing systematically from forward positions, consolidating closer to Madang, where supply lines were shorter and air coverage would be available once weather permitted sustained operations. The depot had been scheduled for complete evacuation within 2 days, with demolition charges already placed on the fuel drums and major structures. Only the unexpected intensity of the weather had prevented completion of the destruction plan. This information should have been reassuring. It suggested the Japanese weren't planning immediate counterattack, but it carried its own troubling implications. If they'd been willing to destroy the supplies rather than allow capture, it meant those supplies weren't critical to their operations. The real value might be in the infrastructure itself, in buildings that provided shelter and logistics capacity in terrain that made everything difficult. The Japanese might not counterattack to reclaim supplies they'd already written off, but they might absolutely target the position once their aircraft could fly, eliminating an Australian logistics hub before it became established. The depot was simultaneously prize and trap, and Morris couldn't determine which characterization was more accurate. The engineers arrived not in 4 to 6 hours, but in 9, having encountered multiple obstacles that required clearing or bypassing. They emerged from the rain looking like animated mud sculptures, exhausted, but carrying equipment that suggested they intended to make the depot functional, despite conditions that would have discouraged less determined men. Their leader, Captain Byrne, who'd assessed the Japanese track earlier, surveyed the position with the calculating eye of someone already planning modifications. Quote, 37, he announced, which was engineering speak for, quote, 38. Morris watched engineers begin their work, assessing structures, cataloging supplies, planning improvements, and felt the operation transition from raid to occupation. They weren't just seizing an objective anymore. They were attempting to establish permanent presence in terrain that Japanese forces had spent months learning to operate in and had ultimately decided wasn't sustainable. The calculation that weather provided enough advantage to make the unsustainable sustainable felt increasingly fragile. Above them, clouds pressed down in their usual oppressive weight, but Morris found himself checking the sky constantly anyway, waiting for the break that would come eventually, and wondering what it would reveal about whether their gamble had been brilliant or foolish. The rain continued, and the engineers worked, and somewhere in the distance, Japanese commanders were presumably making their own calculations about what could be tolerated and what required response. The answer would come soon enough, delivered either through continued silence or through violence that the weather could delay but not prevent indefinitely. The Japanese response came not through the expected ground assault or aerial bombardment, but through artillery fire that announced itself with a shriek Morris recognized from earlier campaigns as a 105 mm howitzer. The first round impacted 200 yards short, throwing mud skyward in a geyser that collapsed back to earth with a wet slap. The second round came closer, landing in the open ground between the depot's perimeter and the tree line. Someone had registered the position, was walking fire toward it with the methodical patience of gunners who knew they couldn't see their target, but had coordinates and were willing to expend ammunition until they found the range. Morris ordered everyone into the most substantial buildings, the ones with proper roofing that might offer protection against airbursts, if not direct hits. The engineers protested briefly. They'd been in the middle of assessing structural integrity and didn't want soldiers crowding spaces they were trying to survey. But protest died when the third shell landed inside the perimeter, detonating against a storage shed and collapsing its roof in a scream of tortured metal. The bombardment settled into a rhythm, one shell every 2 to 3 minutes, each impact suggesting the gunners were bracketing the target, walking their fire across the depot's footprint with the inexorable logic of people working from a map rather than direct observation. The shelling continued for an hour, which represented either substantial ammunition expenditure or demonstration that the Japanese considered this position worth the cost. Most rounds impacted in open ground, where they did little beyond create craters that would immediately fill with water. Several hit structures, collapsing walls or punching holes through roofs, but rarely achieving the kind of precision that would suggest direct observation. One round landed near the fuel drums Morris's platoon had inventoried earlier, close enough that everyone held their breath, waiting for a secondary explosion that mercifully didn't come. The rain, constant companion and occasional enemy, was also protection. It dampened blast effects, absorbed shrapnel, turned the entire depot into saturated earth that didn't fragment into deadly projectiles the way dry ground would have. When the shelling stopped, the silence felt temporary, a pause rather than conclusion. Morris emerged from cover to assess damage and found Captain Byrne already conducting his own survey with the focused attention of someone calculating repair costs against operational value. 3 structures were beyond salvage, their roofs collapsed and walls leaning at angles that suggested imminent total failure. 2 more were damaged but potentially repairable. The fuel drums had miraculously survived intact, though several ammunition crates had been buried under debris that would require clearing before their contents could be recovered. The overall assessment: the depot remained functional but substantially degraded, and any additional shelling would likely render it unusable. Hendricks came up on the radio within minutes of the bombardment's conclusion, which suggested he'd been monitoring the situation and waiting to communicate until the immediate danger passed. His questions were tactical rather than concerned. Casualties, damage assessment, defensive capability if ground assault followed. Morris provided answers that sounded more confident than he felt, knowing that Hendricks was calculating whether to reinforce the position or order withdrawal. The decision came faster than expected. Hold for now, but be prepared to evacuate on short notice if artillery resumed or if aerial reconnaissance indicated imminent ground assault. The prisoner they'd taken earlier, the young Japanese soldier who'd been talkative with Corporal Deacon, provided information that recontextualized the shelling. The artillery piece was positioned approximately 3 miles northwest, part of a defensive line the Japanese were establishing closer to Madang. The bombardment had been less about destroying the depot and more about demonstrating reach, about reminding Australian forces that distance provided incomplete protection. According to the prisoner, his unit had been told that Australian advances during the monsoon represented temporary gains that would be reversed once weather normalized and proper operations could resume. The shelling was psychological as much as tactical, an announcement that Japanese forces hadn't conceded the sector despite withdrawing from forward positions. This intelligence suggested a longer game than Morris had been contemplating. The Japanese weren't simply retreating, they were trading space for time, consolidating into positions they could actually sustain while waiting for weather to restore their operational advantages. The Australian offensive had seized terrain, but terrain without the capability to hold it was just geography. The real question was whether the logistics infrastructure being established at places like this depot could be made robust enough to support defensive operations once the weather broke and Japanese aircraft returned in force. Lieutenant Patterson's platoon arrived mid-afternoon with news that complicated strategic calculations considerably. They'd encountered a Japanese patrol probing Australian positions along the ridge complex, but the patrol had withdrawn without serious engagement. More significantly, they'd observed what appeared to be substantial Japanese troop movements in the valley below, units repositioning in ways that suggested preparation for something larger than defensive consolidation. Patterson couldn't determine whether this represented preparation for counteroffensive once weather permitted, or simply continued withdrawal toward more defensible positions. But the scale of movement indicated significant forces remained active, despite the monsoon's grinding effects. The weather itself showed signs of transition that Weymouth's earlier forecasts hadn't predicted. The rain continued, but with less intensity than previous days, and the cloud ceiling had risen perceptibly. Morris estimated it at 600 or 700 feet now, rather than the 300 to 400 that had characterized the past week. This was still far below what aircraft needed for effective operations, but the trend suggested improvement that would eventually enable resumption of aerial warfare. The window of weather-enabled advantage was closing not with sudden finality, but with gradual erosion, each day bringing conditions incrementally closer to normalcy. Weymouth himself acknowledged this when he arrived at the depot that evening, having made the journey specifically to take measurements in what he called the forward operational environment. His barometric readings showed pressure rising slowly but steadily, the kind of pattern that suggested the system feeding the monsoon was weakening. 3 days, he predicted, cleaning his spectacles with methodical care. Possibly 4. Then we're looking at conditions that will permit intermittent air operations, 5 to 7 days before normal flight operations resume. He delivered this forecast with the neutral tone of someone reporting data, apparently unaware or unconcerned that his predictions were essentially countdown timers on tactical advantage. Morris did the mathematics privately. 3 to 4 days before Japanese aircraft could operate intermittently meant 3 to 4 days to consolidate gains, establish supply lines, and prepare defensive positions that would need to withstand attacks that had proven devastating in previous phases of the campaign. It also meant 3 to 4 days for Japanese forces to complete whatever preparations they were making, to position artillery that could interdict Australian supply routes, to establish positions that would be substantially harder to assault once mutual visibility improved. The weather had created a temporary equalizer, but temporary was expiring on a schedule nobody controlled. That night brought a development that suggested Japanese forces were adapting their tactics faster than Australian intelligence had anticipated. Small unit raids commenced against multiple positions along the extended Australian line, each raid apparently timed to exploit gaps in defensive coverage and withdraw before effective response could be organized. Morris's depot position received a probe around 0200 hours, a squad-sized element that infiltrated close enough to throw grenades before melting back into darkness. The attack inflicted minimal damage, but achieved something more valuable. It demonstrated that Japanese forces had mapped Australian positions, identified vulnerabilities, and were willing to operate in the same weather conditions that had supposedly grounded their military effectiveness. This tactical adaptation fundamentally changed the equation. If both sides were now operating in monsoon conditions, then weather no longer provided asymmetric advantage. It just made everything equally miserable while favouring whoever knew the terrain better and had shorter supply lines. The Japanese had both advantages in most sectors. Australian forces were operating at the end of tenuous logistics chains through terrain they'd occupied for days, while their opponents had been there for months or years. The offensive that had seemed brilliant when weather-grounded Japanese aircraft now looked potentially precarious as that advantage eroded. Hendricks convened a radio conference at 0600, all unit commanders reporting their situations simultaneously for the first time since the offensive began. The pattern that emerged was consistent across the sector, initial gains being consolidated but at substantial cost, supply lines stretched beyond comfortable limits, casualty rates lower than conventional operations but still accumulating, and growing evidence that Japanese forces were adapting rather than simply absorbing pressure. The strategic question nobody was asking directly, but everyone was calculating. Had they advanced far enough during the weather window to justify what it would cost to hold once that window closed? The answer came not from command, but from intelligence intercepts that signals units passed up the chain with remarkable speed. Japanese forces had been monitoring Australian radio traffic, plotting unit positions from transmission patterns, and were preparing a coordinated response timed to coincide with weather improvement. The intercepts specified timeline, 5 days, and general objectives. Isolate Australian forward positions, interdict supply lines, force withdrawal before defensive positions could be properly established. The Japanese weren't waiting for perfect weather. They were preparing to attack as soon as conditions permitted minimal air support, betting that Australian forces would be vulnerable during the transition from offensive to defensive posture. Morris read this intelligence summary and felt the tactical situation crystallize with uncomfortable clarity. They had perhaps 4 days before Japanese aircraft could fly intermittently, and 5 days before coordinated counteroffensive commenced. In that window, they needed to transform captured positions into defensible strongpoints, establish supply lines robust enough to survive interdiction attempts, and prepare for fighting that would reverse every advantage weather had provided. The depot where he currently sat represented either critical logistics infrastructure or an obvious target that would draw fire the moment Japanese observers could see it. Determining which characterization was accurate would require surviving long enough to find out, and survival was looking increasingly like a matter of whether calculation and preparation could substitute for the weather protection that had enabled everything so far. Above, clouds still pressed down, but lighter now, less oppressive, showing hints of breaks that might become gaps that might become clear sky. The countdown had begun, marked not in hours, but in incremental improvements in visibility, each one bringing closer the moment when the war would resume its normal character and reveal whether the Monsoon Offensive had been tactical brilliance or strategic overreach that simply hadn't yet presented its bill. The order to withdraw came on the 8th day, encoded in language that tried to make retreat sound like tactical repositioning. All forward elements were to contract to defensible perimeters, prioritize evacuation of wounded and critical supplies, prepare demolitions for infrastructure that couldn't be held. Hendricks delivered the directive with the flat affect of someone reading words he disagreed with but lacked authority to countermand. Higher command had concluded that holding the extended positions through the transition period, when weather improved enough for Japanese operations but Australian defenses remained incomplete, represented unacceptable risk. Better to consolidate now from positions of relative strength than be forced to withdraw under fire when aircraft returned. Morris read the order 3 times, each reading producing the same hollow sensation of watching effort dissolve into contingency planning. 8 days of advancing through conditions that had killed men through simple accumulated misery, seizing positions at cost measured in exhaustion and injury, if not always blood, establishing supply lines that had required engineering miracles to function. All of it now reduced to controlled abandonment. The depot his platoon had secured, where Captain Burns' engineers had invested 2 days making functional, would be demolished. The fuel drums they'd inventoried would be drained into the mud. The ammunition crates would be buried or destroyed. The ridge positions taken during that first desperate climb would be evacuated, returned to contested ground, or Japanese occupation, depending on how aggressively the enemy chose to follow up. But before withdrawal could commence, supplies had to be moved, and infrastructure had to be destroyed in ways that would delay Japanese reoccupation without providing them salvageable materials. The engineers approached this task with the same methodical efficiency they'd shown building things, which Morris found oddly disturbing. Watching men place demolition charges on structures they'd just finished repairing suggested a futility that extended beyond this particular operation into something larger about military logistics and wasted effort. Burns seemed unbothered by the philosophical implications, focused entirely on practical questions of how much explosive to use and where to place it for maximum structural damage. The withdrawal sequence began at dusk, time to use remaining daylight for movement, while darkness would cover the final stages. Wounded were evacuated first, a process that revealed just how many men had sustained injuries considered insufficiently serious to warrant earlier evacuation, but serious enough to impair combat effectiveness. Morris counted 11 soldiers from his platoon alone who needed assistance moving, nearly a third of his effective strength compromised by accumulated damage from terrain, weather, and sporadic enemy contact. Multiplied across the entire operation, the casualty figures suggested the offensive had been substantially more costly than official reports acknowledged. The route back followed the captured Japanese track, now improved by Australian engineering, but still marginal infrastructure for moving large numbers of troops and equipment simultaneously. The column stretched for over a mile, moving in darkness, broken only by occasional lightning that revealed the long line of soldiers trudging through mud that had become as familiar as any terrain they'd ever trained on. Morris walked near the rear, positioned to help stragglers and ensure nobody got separated in conditions where separation meant potential capture or death from exposure. Twice he helped men who'd simply sat down in exhaustion, their bodies deciding rest was worth whatever consequences followed. He got them moving again through a combination of encouragement and threat, knowing both were equally hollow, but sometimes performance of authority sufficed when actual authority was absent. The demolitions at the depot went off at 2200 hours, the explosions visible as brief orange flashes miles behind the withdrawing column. Morris imagined fuel drums rupturing, buildings collapsing, supplies burning, all the material they'd secured being converted to denial assets, useful only insofar as they were rendered useless to everyone. The prisoner they'd taken, the young Japanese soldier who'd been marching with the column under guard, watched the explosions without visible reaction. Corporal Deacon asked him something in Japanese, received a response that made him laugh without humor. "He says we're doing his former commander's work for them," Deacon translated. "They'd planned to destroy it all anyway. We just saved them the trouble." The observation stung because it was accurate. The entire offensive had been predicated on seizing what the Japanese were already abandoning, occupying positions they decided weren't sustainable, exploiting supply infrastructure they'd been planning to demolish. The weather had enabled movement and reduced casualties from aerial attack, but it hadn't fundamentally altered the strategic calculation that this terrain, in these conditions, at the end of these supply lines, couldn't be held by either side indefinitely. Australian forces were learning what Japanese forces had already concluded, that winning battles in New Guinea meant solving logistics problems that defied conventional solutions, and that weather affected logistics more profoundly than it affected combat. By midnight, the column had covered 6 miles, putting distance between themselves and forward positions while moving toward the consolidated defensive line that Australian forces would attempt to hold through the coming transition period. The rain had stopped entirely now, a development that should have been relief, but instead felt ominous. Stars were visible through breaks in the cloud cover, the first Morris had seen in over a week. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Beautiful because humans instinctively appreciate clear skies, terrifying because clear skies meant Japanese aircraft would fly at dawn, and the withdrawal column would be exposed on terrain that offered minimal concealment. Hendricks recognized the danger, ordering the column to increase pace despite exhaustion that made every step an exercise in sustained willpower. They needed to reach the tree line 3 miles ahead before daylight, needed overhead cover before aircraft could catch them in the open. The order was acknowledged, but implementation was difficult. You couldn't make exhausted men move faster through mud by simply demanding it. Speed required energy reserves that most soldiers had depleted days earlier, sustained now only through the automatic momentum of putting one foot in front of another, because stopping was unthinkable, even if continuing felt impossible. Dawn arrived with the clarity that Morris had been dreading, the sun breaking over the horizon to illuminate a valley that looked almost beautiful in morning light after so many days of gray obscurity. Almost beautiful, except for the military detritus scattered across the landscape, abandoned positions, burned structures, the churned mud of ground that thousands of boots and hundreds of wheels had reduced to abstract sculpture. And above, against the blue sky that had been absent for so long, the distant speck that resolved into an aircraft, and then multiple aircraft, Japanese reconnaissance flights taking advantage of the first clear weather to assess what had changed during their forced grounding. The column reached the tree line with minutes to spare, soldiers diving into whatever cover the jungle provided as the first aircraft made its pass overhead. No bombs fell. These were reconnaissance flights, not combat missions, but their presence announced that the operational picture had fundamentally changed. Japanese commanders now had visual confirmation of Australian positions, could see the withdrawal in progress, could begin planning responses that would exploit the vulnerability of forces caught between forward positions being abandoned and rear positions not yet fully prepared. The aircraft circled for perhaps 20 minutes, clearly photographing everything visible, then departed toward Madang to deliver their intelligence to headquarters that would begin planning whatever came next. Morris watched them go and tried to calculate what the photographs would reveal. Units withdrawing in reasonable order rather than routed, defensive positions partially prepared along the consolidated line, supply columns moving with adequate security rather than in panicked flight. The images would show Australian forces as organized and capable, which was accurate in its way, but they wouldn't show the exhaustion, the depleted ammunition reserves, the medical supplies running low, the vehicles breaking down faster than mechanics could repair them, or the soldiers operating on determination that was itself nearly exhausted. Photography captured surfaces, and surfaces could be misleading. The wireless operators picked up Japanese radio traffic that afternoon, encoded transmissions between aircraft and ground stations that signals intelligence couldn't fully decrypt but could analyze for volume and pattern. The assessment was troubling. Japanese forces were coordinating across multiple sectors, preparing responses that would be implemented simultaneously rather than piecemeal. The Monsoon Offensive had apparently prompted Japanese high command to recognize that their previous doctrine of relying primarily on air superiority required modification. They were adapting, developing ground capabilities that could function during weather that grounded or restricted aircraft, preparing for a campaign that would look different from what either side had anticipated when the fighting began. Lieutenant Patterson, whose platoon had been ranging ahead as advance guard, sent back a report that confirmed what reconnaissance flights had likely photographed. Japanese forces were reoccupying positions Australian troops had abandoned just hours earlier, moving forward in what appeared to be reconnaissance in force rather than tentative probing. They weren't waiting for perfect conditions or complete air superiority. They were pressing whatever advantage the Australian withdrawal had created, testing defensive lines that weren't yet fully established. Patterson's recommendation was immediate. Accelerate withdrawal timeline, prioritize preparation of final defensive positions, accept that some equipment and supplies would have to be abandoned rather than risk the column being caught during repositioning. Hendricks accepted the recommendation, issuing orders that essentially converted organized withdrawal into something closer to retreat, though nobody used that term in official communications. Units were authorized to abandon non-essential equipment, destroy what couldn't be carried, prioritize movement speed over everything except security. The column's character changed immediately. soldiers discarding personal items to reduce load, engineers demolishing vehicles that couldn't keep pace, medics making grim decisions about which wounded could be moved and which would need to be left with minimal guard pending later evacuation. War's mathematics becoming visible in real time. Each calculation about weight and speed and risk translating into decisions that would haunt whoever made them, but had to be made regardless. The consolidated defensive line, when they finally reached it near dusk on the 9th day, looked less substantial than Morris had hoped. Partially dug trenches, hastily constructed bunkers, fields of fire that had been cleared but not properly developed, supply dumps that contained perhaps half what would be needed if Japanese forces pressed attacks with determination. Engineers were still working, heavy equipment grinding through the mud, attempting to create the kind of infrastructure that normally required weeks but was being demanded in days. Officers were positioning units, assigning sectors, establishing communication lines that would theoretically allow coordinated defense when aircraft returned and artillery opened up and infantry probes became actual assaults. Morris positioned his platoon in a section of trench that was more concept than reality, the walls still slumping despite sandbags and wooden reinforcement. He checked ammunition distribution and found his men were down to perhaps 60 rounds each, adequate for brief engagements but insufficient for sustained defense. He requested resupply and was told ammunition was being rationed pending arrival of columns that were somewhere behind them, delayed by terrain and weather and the general friction that made everything difficult. Estimated arrival, 12 to 18 hours. Estimated resumption of Japanese operations, approximately the same time frame. The mathematics were uncomfortable. Night fell on defensive positions that felt more psychological than physical. Soldiers occupying ground and hoping preparation would prove adequate when tested. Morris sat in the trench listening to sounds that had become familiar. Rain resuming its percussion, men talking quietly, the distant rumble of equipment, the closer sound of someone crying with exhaustion they couldn't acknowledge while awake. Above, clouds had returned, lower now than during the clear spell, but still substantially higher than during the monsoon's peak. The weather that had enabled everything was becoming just weather again, neither ally nor enemy, but simply conditions that both sides would operate through until this phase ended and the next began. Whatever that next phase looked like would reveal whether the Monsoon Offensive had achieved anything lasting, or had simply been an interlude, a brief period where tactical opportunity had seemed like strategic advantage before reality reasserted its less accommodating truths. The Japanese attack came 3 days after the defensive line was established, not with the overwhelming force Morris had been anticipating, but with probing actions that tested multiple sectors simultaneously. Aircraft appeared at dawn, bombers escorted by fighters that swept low over Australian positions, with the confidence of forces that had recovered their primary advantage. The bombardment was methodical rather than devastating, designed to suppress defensive fire and identify strong points rather than obliterate positions. Morris watched explosions walk across terrain his platoon had traversed during the offensive, and understood they were seeing the reconnaissance photographs translated into target coordinates. The images from those first clear weather flights now guiding ordnance onto positions that had seemed abstract when photographed, but were now very specifically real. The ground assault followed the aerial bombardment with practiced coordination. Japanese infantry advancing under cover fire that suggested they'd spent the intervening days planning this operation, rather than simply reacting to Australian withdrawal. But the attack wasn't the overwhelming push Morris had feared. It was measured, almost cautious, probing defensive strength without committing forces that couldn't be withdrawn if resistance proved substantial. The engagements were sharp but brief, Japanese forces pulling back after establishing that Australian positions were manned and prepared to defend, that the withdrawal hadn't been rout but tactical repositioning. Both sides had learned from the monsoon period, the Japanese that they couldn't rely solely on air superiority, the Australians that weather could enable movement but couldn't substitute for defensive preparation. The defensive line held through the first day's fighting, partly through the efforts of exhausted soldiers who'd found reserves they hadn't known they possessed, and partly through Japanese unwillingness to commit to attacks that would be costly regardless of outcome. Casualties were lighter than previous operations had produced during clear weather, a data point that military analysts would later cite as evidence that both sides had adapted doctrine to account for the monsoon's lessons. Artillery exchanges remained limited by ammunition concerns on both sides. Airstrikes continued, but with precision that suggested respect for Australian anti-aircraft capabilities that had been enhanced during the consolidation period. The fighting had characteristics of armies that had learned to be careful, that understood overextension in this terrain carried consequences neither side could easily afford. Weymouth appeared on the fourth day of the defensive phase, looking even more bedraggled than during his previous visits. His measurements showed barometric pressure stabilising in the normal range, wind patterns suggesting the monsoon system had definitively broken apart, and long-range forecasts indicating the heavy rains wouldn't return for months. "The window has closed," he announced with the finality of someone documenting the end of a natural phenomenon, apparently unaware he was also documenting the end of tactical conditions that had defined operations for the past 2 weeks. Morris thanked him again, still uncertain what gratitude meant in this context, but recognizing that Weymouth's predictions had been more accurate than anyone had right to expect when attempting to quantify chaos. The strategic assessment came down from brigade headquarters in the form of a document that tried to sound analytical while acknowledging uncertainties that analysis couldn't resolve. The Monsoon Offensive had seized approximately 18 miles of territory, captured substantial intelligence materials, disrupted Japanese supply networks, and demonstrated tactical flexibility that would inform future operations. It had also cost 473 casualties across participating units, lighter than conventional assaults would have produced for equivalent gains, but substantial nonetheless. The territory seized was being partially held through defensive positions that remained vulnerable but defensible, trading the extended exposure of the offensive phase for concentrated strength in prepared positions. Whether the operation qualified as success or expensive stalemate depended on metrics that wouldn't be knowable for months. Whether the disruption to Japanese logistics proved lasting. Whether the defensive line could be sustained through the dry season. Whether the tactical lessons learned justified the costs incurred. Morris read these assessments and recognized the language of command trying to declare victory in situations where victory was ambiguous at best. They'd gambled on weather-enabling operations that conventional doctrine said were impossible, and the gamble had paid off in ways that were simultaneously real and insufficient. They'd proven something about willingness to fight in conditions others considered prohibitive, but proving something and achieving something weren't necessarily the same. The prisoner they'd taken, the young Japanese soldier who'd marched with them through the withdrawal, was eventually transferred to a rear area detention facility. Before departing, he spoke with Corporal Deacon one final time, offering an observation that Deacon translated with evident discomfort. The soldier said both armies had been defeated by New Guinea itself, that the real enemy was terrain and weather and disease, and that whoever eventually won would be the side that lost less catastrophically, rather than the side that actually prevailed. Deacon asked if Morris wanted to hear more, but Morris declined. Some observations were too accurate to be useful, acknowledging realities that soldiers needed to not think about in order to keep functioning. The Monsoon Offensive entered official records as a tactical success, got mentioned in dispatches that worked their way up through command structures, and became the subject of after-action reports that would inform doctrine development for operations in tropical environments. Historians would later examine it as an example of weather-enabled maneuver warfare, of commanders recognizing and exploiting temporary asymmetric advantages, of tactical adaptation under difficult conditions. None of these analyses would fully capture what Morris remembered most clearly: the sound of rain that never stopped, the weight of equipment that never dried, the faces of men who'd kept moving because stopping meant acknowledging they couldn't continue. The offensive had been executed during the monsoon because the monsoon grounded enemy aircraft, but it had also been endured through the monsoon, despite everything the monsoon inflicted on soldiers who had no choice but to accept conditions that made survival feel like an active accomplishment rather than default state. Morris remained in New Guinea for another 8 months, participating in operations that followed different tactical logic as dry season replaced monsoon and the war ground forward through its own relentless mathematics. The lessons of the Monsoon Offensive were applied inconsistently. Some commanders recognised the value of weather-timed operations, others dismissed it as an opportunistic gamble that couldn't be relied upon strategically. But everyone who'd participated understood something that couldn't be fully articulated in official reports: that conventional doctrine represented guidelines rather than absolute limits, that conditions which seemed prohibitive could be tolerated if the alternative was accepting outcomes that couldn't be tolerated, and that victory in this kind of war meant surviving long enough to be present when the enemy finally decided they couldn't survive any longer. The monsoon had been both weapon and adversary, enabling movement while extracting its own costs, and Morris never looked at rain the same way afterward. Subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. Your engagement helps us continue creating detailed historical content like this. Share your thoughts on the Monsoon Offensive tactics, or suggest topics for future episodes in the comments below.